John Kane coming up. It is 3 p.m.
Don't give up, don't give in. Don't you let the man win. Stand up, be proud. Say it with me, yeah. Say it loud. We will not be idle in the dark. We will not be
Sago, I'm John Kane, and this is Resistance Radio. I want to thank you for joining me here. It is, as always, a pleasure to be broadcasting in New York City on WBAI and on WPFW in Washington, D.C. I want to remind people we are listener-supported radio, and we rely on your contributions. So, again, I ask that you support WBAI and WPFW and do so as often as you can, or become a sustaining member of either one of those stations, and mention Resistance Radio as you as you do that. Um, Look, we put the show up as a podcast. We put the show up on YouTube and on Facebook. So there's any number of ways you can either see or watch the show. Last week, I had the pleasure of joining my good buddy here, Reggie Johnson, in New York City. I came down and we
Yes, you
did the show.
did.
Yes, we did, and it was great to join you. And I look, I even did something unusual. I put you on camera, so I hopefully hopefully
Yeah,
you
I
did.
just realized that. I just realized that when you sent me the notification earlier today.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I did that. So again, I figured, yeah, why not let people see what Reggie looks like every once in a while? So, all right. So
Yeah, why not?
this this week on Tuesday, November 11th, was the 231st anniversary of the Canandaigua Treaty. So I want to do a show on that, and I want to do a show on that because frankly, I'm not a fan. I'm not. Not only am I not a fan of the treaty itself, and I'm using that term really loosely. I'm not a fan of how it is represented visually with images. There's a wampum belt that is oftentimes mischaracteristically put out as a representation of that treaty. I'm going to address that issue. But I'm also going to address some of the validity of the whole thing. And let's be honest, all the treaties are violated anyway. So the question is, why would we, as far as Native people go, celebrate the anniversary of this treaty? And let me just say this: we do. I mean, I got to tell you, there every year, and I don't know so much this year because we had snow, but every year, uh, legions of Native people go to Canandaigua, New York, which is right there on the Finger Lakes. And they do a little arm in arm march from the courthouse, the county courthouse, and they celebrate the Canandaigua Treaty as this terrific sign of friendship and unification and all this other stuff that's not even true. So I'm going to talk. But here's the thing about the Canandaigua Treaty: it's only 7 articles long, so I get a chance to really talk to you and explain to you exactly what is the treaty. And that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to go through article by article. And the first one's relatively easy because it's only like one line long. It says peace and friendship. This is Article 1 of the Canandaigua Treaty from November 11th, 1794. And I'll keep mentioning that date, 1794, because I think it's worth mentioning in terms of other dates that that should be considered when thinking about this. So again, Article 1 says peace and friendship are hereby firmly established and shall be perpetual between the United States and the Six Nations. All right. First problem, it's even mentioned in the whole treaty. The Tuscarora and the Mohawks they're not mentioned, and I will say this as a matter of fact, no Mohawks signed this. And part of the reason no Mohawks would be signatories to this treaty was they were not being allowed to read the language of the treaty. In fact, what the white folks said is, well, you use your wampums, we use the pen. So our people weren't even given the opportunity to fully read and understand what was being put to them to agree upon. So anyway, Article 1 just says a peace and friendship are hereby established with the Six Nations, even though only 4 of them are mentioned. Okay, Article 2. Article 2 mentions 3 of those nations. And here's what it says. And I think it's important that people understand what it says because keep in mind, this is 1794. We also know that about 29 years later, much of the language about land title and ownership would be questioned under the doctrine of Christian discovery. So again, here we are, 1794, November 11th. The United States acknowledges the lands reserved to the Oneida, Onondaga, and Cayuga nations in their respective treaties with the state of New York, and called their reservations to be their property, and the United States will never claim the same, nor disturb them, or either of the Six Nations, nor any of their Indian friends residing thereon, and united with them in the free use and enjoyment thereof. So, to be clear, the United States is saying, again, to the Oneidas, the Onondagas, and the Cayuga, we recognize that the land is yours. The property, the title, the land, the property, it's yours. 1794, they're saying, we are recognizing here is the United States, and we didn't write this. Let me be clear. White folks wrote this. White folks representing the President of the United States, who was George Washington, they wrote this. They wrote in a specific treaty that they drafted and they crafted saying, we recognize that the land is yours and that we will never claim the same. Of course, you can sell it. That's what they say later. You can sell it, but we will never claim it. We will never make a claim on your lands. That's Article 2 of the Canandaigua Treaty. Article 3 gets a little bit more complicated because one of the main reasons for the treaty was to contain the Seneca Nation. Seneca Nation, which was kind of problematic for the United States. And in fact, it was only, what was it, in 1779 that George Washington was essentially waging war against the Senecas, the Cayugas too, but mostly the Senecas. And he launched what they called the Sullivan Campaign, which is, and the Sullivan Campaign was really an attempt to devastate the Seneca Nation. Not just by the amount of people that would be killed, because many of the men weren't there within the Seneca territory. They were basically up at Fort Niagara at the time. So when they launched this campaign, which essentially ran from June to October of 1779, they killed about 1,000 Native people. And we're not just talking about quote unquote warriors. We're talking about killed about 1,000 Native people. But they also destroyed all of their food supply. And by some accounts, 5,000 people starved to death because of George Washington's campaign, Sullivan Campaign. And he basically said, let them know the terror of their chastisement. And so why was he waging war against the Senecas? Well, the Senecas were honoring their relationship with Great Britain during some of the Revolutionary War. That's why. So they were going to make the Senecas suffer intergenerational trauma. And if you kill 1,000 Senecas and cause 5,000 more to starve to death, and of course, when you talk about starvation, it goes without saying that the ones who starve are mostly the most vulnerable: the elderly, the children, and the women. So that's what George Washington did. Essentially, again, we're talking about 1779. So this is, not that long, but it's like 15 years before this much So in Article 3, they're essentially carving up the Seneca's territory. They're putting the boundaries, and much of the language is hard to understand if you understand English. I mean, they talk about the northwest corner of the land they sold to Oliver Phelps. The line runs westerly along the lake as far as the Onondaga Creek to Johnson's Landing Place for about 4 miles eastward to Fort Niagara, then southerly up the creek. Anyway, I could go on. But it is really language that is hard to make out and language that, frankly, we would not be allowed to read. So they do this whole line around Seneca territory. And then they go on to say, now the United States acknowledge all the land within the aforementioned boundaries to be the property of the Seneca Nation. And the United States, again, the United States will never claim the same nor disturb the Seneca Nation or any of their Six Nation friends or allies residing thereon, and united with them in the free use and enjoyment thereof. So again, just like they said in Article 2, this time they were talking specifically to the Senecas, saying, now that we've carved up your land and we've put a box around you that we don't even know if you fully understand it, but now that we put that box around you, we're saying we're acknowledging that the land within those aforementioned boundaries are yours, and we'll never claim the same. Let me say it again. No doctrine of Christian discovery here. No, we're claiming your title because we're Christians and you're not. None of that. Just we acknowledge that the property that we are now establishing is yours. And of course, they're saying the property for the Onondagas, the Oneidas, and Cougars, that was already established in other treaties with the state of New York. And now we've established what the boundaries of the Seneca Nation are. Now, again, there's no language in any of this stuff about the Tuscarora or the Mohawks. There's no boundaries and there's no acknowledgement of their lands, although they're saying none of the Six Nations will be disturbed in their lands. And you assume that they're talking about the lands that they've detailed here. So that's Article 3. Article 4 is basically restating it once again. I've mentioned this before, that 3 times they say the same thing. The United States, having thus described and acknowledged what lands belong, in other words, are owned, belong to the Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, and Senecas, and engaged never to claim the same nor disturb them. So that's what they're saying in Article 4. But they go on to say, now the Six Nations, and each of them, hereby engage that they will never claim any other lands within the boundaries of the United States. So now they're saying no takebacks. Now that we've carved up some of your lands and we're acknowledging the lands that we've reserved for you, you're never going to claim any other lands. Now keep in mind, this is what they're saying in 1794. And almost none of that will ever be honored, because much of that land will be carved up, much of that land will be claimed, much of that land will be lost through leases, not just sales, but through leases. And they would violate the 3, and you could argue 4 terms, because that's not friendship, folks. That's not friendship if you're screwing people out of their land. So that's Article 4 is basically, once again, reiterating that the United States recognizes that the lands of those 4 of the Six Nations are theirs, but also that none of the Six Nations will ever claim any other land. They will never do any takebacks. No takebacks. That's what they basically were saying. All right, Article 5. So Article 5 is about establishing a road, basically, through Seneca territory and arguably Tuscarora territory, which would have connected Fort Niagara, or not Fort Niagara, but Fort Schlosser, which is up near the Niagara Falls, Fort Schlosser down to what they called Buffalo Creek, so that a road would be built. But it goes on farther, because then it says, and the Six Nations in each of them will forever allow the people of the United States a free passage through their lands and free use of the harbors and rivers adjoining and within the respective tracts of land for the passing and securing of vessels and boats and such. So Article 5 basically is saying, we're going to build a road, and you're going to allow us to. You're going to give us permission. You're going to cede certain. Well, actually, it doesn't even say they're going to cede the land. This is going to cede the United States the right of making a road. So it's basically, you're going to cede to us the right to make a road through your lands. That's basically what it's saying. And then you're not going to cede land, but you're going to allow us free passage through any of your territories anytime we want, and including any of your waterways, any of your harbors. You're going to allow us full access to basically your lands. That's basically what Article 5 says. Now, again, you have to assume that if this was a legitimate treaty, our people will have fully understood what they're saying here. Although we weren't necessarily given the written copy to have any of our English-speaking folks understand this. And there were English-speaking folks. In fact, most of the prominent English-speaking folks of the Six Nations who understood, could write and read writing and that kind of stuff, read and write, were Mohawks. And they were denied access to read any of this stuff. That's why they didn't sign any of it. So that's Article 5. So Article 6 is what the United States is going to compensate us with. So they said, we're going to give you $10,000 worth of goods. We're going to give you a quantity of goods, the value of $10,000 to be distributed amongst the Six Nations. It doesn't say how or where. And again, the Mohawks and the Tuscaroras are never specifically mentioned in this thing. So that's $10,000 with the so-called treaty. Then they go on to make a promise to making the whole of $4,500, which shall be expended yearly forever in the purchasing of clothing, domestic animals, implements, and husbandry, and other utensils suited for their circumstances. So, $4,000 forever. No cost of living increases or anything else. So, ironically, this portion of the treaty is the only thing that is honored. It's the only part of the treaty that they actually honor. Because here's what the United States does. Every year they've got some poor sap down in Washington whose job it is to requisition $4,500 worth, not of clothing, but of cloth, just cloth. And our people treat it as if it's the Shroud of Turin or something. They distribute, not to everybody, because most people will never see any of this cloth. But so the United States purchases $4,500 worth of cloth, and then they give it to certain representatives of the Six Nations for I guess for us to distribute ourselves. Now I'm going to tell you, I've never seen, I've never touched, I've never owned any of this cloth. It's only $4,500 worth of cloth. Not a lot of cloth, and not enough money to buy livestock or equipment, farm implementations, or anything like that. Nothing like no. So they know it's such a small amount of money that it's never increased with any kind of cost of living adjustments. So now it's just $4,500 worth of cloth. We're talking about bolts of cloth, and not even like expensive cloth, because you wouldn't want to buy expensive cloth because there would be less to distribute that way. So some cheap cloth gets distributed, and again, our people, the people who actually get some of it, they might make a pillow. They might make a pillow with this cloth, or if they can accumulate enough, maybe they'll make a ribbon skirt or a ribbon dress or a ribbon shirt or something like that. But yeah, so this is the only part of the treaty which suggests that the United States is acknowledging the rest of the language in this thing, but they don't honor any of it. The only thing they do is do $4,500 worth of cloth. That's Article 6. And I told you there were 7 articles. Here's the 7th article. And this one's interesting. Because again, it says, lest the firm peace and friendship now established should be interrupted by the misconduct of individuals, the United States and the Six Nations agree that for injuries done by individuals on either side, no private revenge or retaliation will take place. In fact, there will be no trials conducted on the lands of the offended party. In fact, what they're saying is that instead thereof, complaint shall be made by the party injured to the other, by the Six Nations or any of them, to the President of the United States or the superintendent appointed by him, and by the superintendent or other person appointed by the president, to the principal chiefs of the Six Nations or of the nation to which the offender belongs. So, in other words, if somebody commits a crime, if a white man commits a crime, we don't do anything to that person. We don't take them into custody. We don't call the cops. Nope. We make a petition to the President of the United States or his representative. And likewise, if one of our persons were to do something that had violated an American, they will make a complaint to the chief of the nation from that territory where that person is from. That's what was agreed upon, Article 7 of the Canandaigua Treaty. No courts. No, the courts are our remedy, as we were told in 2010 when we went to Washington when they were reevaluating the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. No other remedy was established and written down except for this one in 1794, Article 7 of the Canandaigua Treaty. However, it does say in here, this, let's see, such prudent measures shall then be pursued and shall be necessary to preserve our peace and friendship unbroken until, so this will be the way, until the legislature of the United States shall make other equitable provisions for the purpose. So they're saying, this is what the process is. You will petition the President of the United States, and we will petition your chiefs. That's what the United States said in Article 7 of the Canandaigua Treaty, until we make other equitable provisions. The problem is there's never been any documented equitable provisions proposed and agreed upon. There's no other treaty with the Six Nations that suggests any other equitable provision. So this wasn't any claim that the United States could unilaterally change this without any kind of agreement kind of violates the whole notion of a treaty. So that isn't followed. So only one of the 7 articles, well, we could, yeah, only one of the 7 articles, because they're all broken, including the whole friendship thing, because we have had antagonistic relations with the United States and the member states. The only article that is honored is them spending $4,500 a year for cloth. That's it. Okay, so now I've just explained the whole treaty. That is the whole treaty in its entirety. That's it. So what's my other complaint, other than the fact that this treaty has been violated and is almost non-existent? And I say it's non-existent because, look, first and foremost, 29 years later, the Supreme Court of the United States under Chief Justice John Marshall would say that we don't have title to our lands. In spite of the fact that it's specified in this treaty and many others, by the way. There are several other treaties that is, and I talk about this in our film, by the way, in the Long Hope film. But 29 years later, Chief Justice John Marshall would say the doctrine of Christian discovery that it was already being utilized in some fashion by the superior genius of Europe, that they were imposing it on our lands. They were basically saying we don't have title to our lands. That upon discovery, and this is what Ruth Bader Ginsburg said this in 2005. She said that the lands originally occupied by the Indians, the title to that land would go to the sovereigns, the United States. And she described this under the doctrine of discovery. She left out the word Christian. Maybe as a Jew that was going to stick in her throat or something, but it's the doctrine of Christian discovery. So 29 years after this is so well documented in this so-called Canandaigua Treaty, the whole thing would be voided because the Supreme Court says, oh, no, you don't own title to your land. You merely have the right of occupancy. And we don't mean the right of occupancy as a human right or a civil right or a legal right. We just mean it's, you're kind of here like the animals. So the right that they're talking about is like a natural right. And we know that white men can defy nature. And so they can defy our right of occupancy. In fact, they did it, and they've upheld that right to defy and extinguish the right of occupancy in their courts. They've done that. So this treaty is void except for them paying $4,500 a year in cloth. And you have to argue that they only do that to maintain that they still own all the land that was surrendered. And the Senecas in particular are the ones who surrendered most land in this specific treaty. So the only thing the United States does is pay $4,500 a year for cloth and send it up to the Six Nations. But having described all this, let me describe what really concerns me about some of what happens during the Canandaigua Treaty Day, the celebration of the Canandaigua Treaty. And that is, they will parade around a bunch of wampum belts. When our guys march down the streets of Canandaigua, they'll be carrying the Tura wampum belt, which This represents nothing along the lines of the two-world wampum. This all the treaty represents is ceding territory, and the unfulfilled promise of the United States that we will never be disturbed in our territories. The other wampum belt they carry around is called the George Washington Belt. Now, the George Washington Belt, many of my own people will claim the George Washington Belt represents the Canandaigua Treaty, which is impossible because the Washington Belt was created 2 years prior to this in 1792, not 1794. It was created and it was commissioned by Washington's representatives to have it constructed by an Oneida craftsman. And it's a ridiculously long belt. It's over 6 feet long. And I've seen some that are even longer than that, the replicas that are even longer than that. We don't make belts that long because it doesn't make sense to have something that is so cumbersome like this. But here's the reason it's that long. Because what they have depicted on the belt, and I encourage you to look it up. Please search George Washington belt online and look at images. And what it is it is a long belt that has 13 male figures represented on the belt, across the whole belt, 13 male figures. And then in the center of that, they've got two small little guys represented on either side of a longhouse or a house or structure. So when you look at the belt, what you see is in the center is you see a house with two guys on either side of it, small guys, and then 7 on one side, 6 on the other, big men showing their superiority in stature alone over the two little guys. And who are the two little guys? Now, you could almost assume, well, since some of the Six Nations were not, allies of the United States prior to this, maybe those two guys represent the Tuscarora and the Oneidas or something. But no, by almost every account, the two men or the two figures on either side of the house represent the eastern and the western door of the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations, the Mohawk and the Seneca. So two little guys on each side of this house, which was to represent our longhouse, are surrounded by 13 much bigger men. And then there's this other interesting part of the belt. There's this thing that this arc that goes over the tops of our heads. And it's held onto by those, again, this line of 13 bigger men. And by every account, we understand that imagery is supposed to represent that we are under the protection of the 13 states, colonies, whatever. And that by stature alone, we are subordinate to the much bigger and more powerful men. Now, I say all this stuff, keeping in mind, nothing in the Canandaigua Treaty represents any of that imagery. Nothing. I mean, for one thing, why wouldn't all 6 nations be represented? Well, because no, we got to put the 13 colonies there, the 13 states, but we're only going to represent the eastern and the western door. So we didn't even get full representation on the belt because it wasn't our belt. It wasn't us crafting what we interpreted the language of the Canandaigua Treaty because the belt was crafted first. So I am always offended every year because you're going to get some quote unquote chief wrap himself up in this belt and he's going to walk down the streets of Canandaigua with this belt around him. And I've seen Onondagas, I've seen Cayugas, I've seen any number. In fact, the Seneca Nation has used that imagery of that belt on some of its buildings. And nobody seems to even take into consideration what the imagery means. See, when I condemn the celebration of Canandaigua Treaty Day, I'm the outlier. Because many people, and I've got into a discussion, even this year, again, I said, we're going to walk down that street and we're going to praise this broken treaty as if it's somehow being honored. And we're going to wrap ourselves up with the George Washington belt. And we're going to pretend that the image on that belt is what is reflected in the treaty when it's not even close. There's nothing in the language of the Canandaigua Treaty that suggests we are subordinate to the 13 states, to the United States. There's nothing that suggests we were subordinate. In fact, even the last article talks about a fairly equitable provision that if there was any problems, we will petition your chiefs and you will petition our president. That's what it says. And it says that they recognize that our land is ours. I mean, that's really all it says. And that they're going to pay us $4,500 a year forever. By the way, that paying us $4,500 every year was not honored because there were many periods of time that the United States didn't do that. In fact, for a period of time, I think they had the state doing it. And the state said, wait a second, we don't have any obligations under a treaty with the United States to provide this stuff to the Six Nations. So anyway, I'm bothered by this because it was never properly ratified on our side. You know, look, almost nothing that the Haudenosaunee do, in Grand Council or otherwise, is valid without Mohawk participation. No Mohawks signed, marked, X'd, put a thumbprint, or did any kind of thing, any kind of mark on the document that was drafted up because we weren't being allowed to read it. And you know what else? It also wasn't ratified on the U.S. side because this never went to the Senate. This never was presented by the President of the United States to the Senate to ratify it, which is the process for ratifying a treaty. I think 2/3 of the Senate has to agree upon it. So this wasn't done. But however, I will say that there was some language when I searched online that Washington did go to Congress to authorize the appropriation, an appropriation to pay for this belt. So I mean, it's absurd to suggest that this treaty is legitimate, even if the United States is spending $4,500 a year in cloth. But what's not absurd is to suggest that the United States acknowledged in the language of this treaty that the property was ours, in spite of what Chief Justice John Marshall would do 29 years later. And here's the thing, and I say this in the film, or I've written this in the film. It's part of the narrative of the Long Hope film. When you consider the language of this treaty and many other treaties where there's a full acknowledgement that we own our lands, and then years later, decades later, the Supreme Court under the Chief Justice John Marshall would say, well, no, you don't really own your lands. The question is, how do you reconcile these two distinctly opposite views? And what would persevere? Well, Ruth Bader Ginsburg answered that in 2005. She basically said, no, you don't have title to your land. Under the doctrine of discovery, the doctrine of Christian discovery, we took that title. And in every case since, and I've mentioned this recently, this has also been stated twice within the last 2 months. Twice in court, in different court proceedings, not by the Supreme Court, but by federal courts, where they acknowledged and asserted title to our lands by way of discovery. In spite of the fact that we have clear language that says otherwise. It just doesn't make any sense, folks. It just doesn't make any sense. But that's what we have. That's what we have. So I have two problems. One is the validity of the Canandaigua Treaty. Although, as many of you know, I have cited the language in this treaty because it's an acknowledgement, even if it's not a legitimate treaty, it's an acknowledgement by the United States that they recognize that we own our lands. I mean, treaty or no treaty, your representatives are saying it. They're writing it. And they're promising to never disturb us in our free use and enjoyment of our lands, not lands that you're allowing us to live on. So I do cite it because it's your language, your words, and your document, not ours. In fact, we were denied access to it. But the other big problem I have with the Canandaigua Treaty is the false representation that belt, look, just because it's a wampum belt doesn't mean that it's ours. I saw one account that said, well, the chiefs of the Six Nations delivered it in Philadelphia to George Washington. No, we didn't. No, they didn't. We never agreed to any of that imagery on the belt. You commissioned an Oneida wampum belt maker, a craftsman in Oneida, who was among your loyal subjects as far as the Six Nations is concerned. The Oneidas, they supported the colonists. They supported Washington. They didn't have any of the conflicts with Washington or Sullivan or anybody else that the rest of us did. No, they completely sided with the colonists. Right or wrong, that's what they did. So if you were going to ask somebody to create a belt that depicts subjugation and submission to the colonies, to the states, it would make sense you would go to an Oneida craftsman. But just because wampum were woven into a belt, an obnoxiously long belt, doesn't mean that it's ours. It was never ours. So that is why I don't spend the month angry over the over Canandaigua Treaty Day, but I'm always going to post something on social media, and I'm always going to confront somebody on it. Because even when people agree with what I say, they say, yeah, but it's an opportunity to come together and stand together. All of us come together. I said, no, all of us don't come together. You still won't see Mohawks going to Canandaigua on November 11th of every year. You won't see us there. And shame on you for going there and never pointing out the obvious. Because going there in full regalia and ribbon shirts and dresses and Gustoas and all that stuff, going there, your presence there doesn't send a signal to the United States that you're violating this treaty. You know what would send a signal? Saying it. Telling them. Because, here's the crazy thing. It's not just us to go there. They got politicians that show up. State and federal representatives show up at these things. I say let's grill them. I don't mean literally put them on a grill. That would be terrible. But no, I'm saying tell them that we fully acknowledge that you have broken every term of this treaty, this alleged treaty. And it's not with the Six Nations, it's only with 4 of them. So it's not even properly enumerated. And all you do is send cloth. I wonder if the federal government shows up at Canandaigua with their bolts of cloth. Somebody would have to clear that up for me. I don't know if that's really the case. But this is the problem, folks. I mean, this is the problem. And if we don't address it properly, then we look like putzes. I mean, we really do. We look submissive. And of course, here's the other thing about November 11th every year. It's Veterans Day. So there's also usually some sort of acknowledgement of Native American soldiers who served in the U.S. military. Here's the thing that I got to say about treaties. If you believe this treaty exists, and look, this has been cited before. This has been cited in legal proceedings. And our people are usually somewhat wary to use treaties. They're afraid that a judge is going to interpret the treaty to mean something other than what we think it means. So there's a fear almost. But here's the thing. If you're Native and you consider yourself a citizen of the United States, hear me out. I know people are going to say, well, of course you're citizens. You're the original Americans. You're the country's first citizens. No, we're not. We weren't included in the U.S. Constitution. We weren't counted. We weren't included. And those are 2 different things. We weren't even counted as persons in the country, and we weren't included as citizens. And that's not a complaint. That's just an acknowledgement. So we weren't U.S. citizens. In 1924, they claimed they passed a law declaring we were U.S. citizens. But if we accept U.S. citizenship, do we even have any treaties anymore? I mean, you could argue that once Chief Justice John Marshall puts out this doctrine of Christian discovery and the trust doctrine, the plenary powers doctrine, do we even have treaties anymore? Well, the United States will still negotiate treaties for another 50 years. So how could you be a citizen of the United States and have a treaty with the United States? Well, I'll tell you how. You can't. No country has treaties with its own citizenship. So, if you accept U.S. citizenship, you have actually taken yourself and you've said, okay, Canandaigua Treaty, I'm not a party to this anyway because I'm a U.S. citizen now. So we can throw that in the trash. That we're not parties to that treaty anymore. I would argue that I'm not a U.S. citizen. So any commitments the United States made to Native people in treaty or otherwise, I'm saying you still have that obligation. All those things you said in that treaty, you still need to be held accountable. That's my position. But if you're a U.S. citizen, you say, oh, no, I don't need that anymore. I'm one of you now. I'm actually on the U.S. side of that treaty. I hate to say it. I hate to quote Charlie Kirk. Prove me wrong. Tell me how I'm wrong. Tell me how I'm wrong. All right. So that's my rant on the Canandaigua Treaty. I'll probably bring it up again next year. But that's my rant on it. And the George Washington belt. As far as I'm concerned, we should throw that away. Or, you know what? We're always told, oh, yeah, you guys sold your wampum belt. You know, that wasn't ours anyway. That the Oneidas were paid to make that thing. As far as I'm concerned, United States, you want your George Washington belt? No, I take it back. I don't even want to sell it back to them. I say destroy it. I say destroy it because every image on that belt is an insult. It's an absolute insult. So anyway, that's my rant on the Canandaigua Treaty and the George Washington belt. All right, so last week I was in New York because we screened The Long Hope, the film that I am one of the executive producers and writers of. And we did it down at the Brooklyn Children's Museum. Nice facility, folks. By the way, if you get a chance to go to Brooklyn, you want to go to the Children's Museum. It is really a nice. It really is a nice venue. And I got to tell you, the auditorium was great. We didn't get the turnout I would have hoped for, but we're going to keep doing it. In fact, on the 20th of this month, we're going to screen it at the up in Rochester, New York. There's a place there that Native people use kind of as their native center, although it's more generally, it's called the Flying Squirrel Community Space. Yep, Flying Squirrel Community Space. So we're going to do a screening of it. I'm going to do my show next week, and then right after that, on the 20th, I'm going to run out to Rochester. We're going to screen the film. I know that my friend Ron Garlow is the one who set it up, and I think they're going to have pizza and stuff like that. So they're going to have refreshments and snacks. So please come out if you're in the Rochester area. Please come out to Rochester and go to the Flying Squirrel Community Space from 7 to 10. I'm going to try to get there a little early so we can do a little bit of a meet and greet before, and then we're going to do a Q&A afterwards. So and I think Ross, John, and Holly John, who are also producers of the film, are going to make the trip as well. After that, on the following Monday, I'm heading out to Woodbury, Connecticut. I was asked specifically by several people to do a screening in Woodbury. So we're going to run out to Connecticut, and we're going to do a screening on the 24th from 1 to 4 o'clock at the Woodbury Public Library in Connecticut. So look forward to that. That's not an area that I'm particularly familiar with. We do plan on doing some other screenings in Connecticut, but more out towards Pequot and territory. So that's what our plan. But this one is going to be kind of on the western part of Connecticut, not far from the New York line. So some of you hearing this show in New York may be close enough to make the trip out to Woodbury, and I'd love to see you out there. It's always nice to get out to the countryside, get out of the city. So please join us, and that's again on November 24th at the Woodbury Public Library from 1 to 4 o'clock. I want to mention, we have a website now. It's called thelonghope.org. Please go to thelonghope.org. You can register on the website, and by registering, you can not only offer some comments about either the trailers that you've seen, or perhaps you've joined us at one of these screenings already. We look forward to hearing your comments. You will also get an opportunity if you wanted to request a screening in an area or make a suggestion. So we're looking for your comments and your suggestions. And I would also say if you register, you will also get an opportunity to see some exclusive content that created. Some of that content are going to be excerpts of the film. Look, we don't have the film published online yet. In fact, this Saturday, the film is going through its official premiere at the Red Nation International Film Festival in Los Angeles. Ross and Holly are both out there in California. They're going to attend our film premiere at the AMC Theater in Los Angeles, right there at the foothills of Hollywood, as a part of the Red Nation International Film Festival, and that's going to be on Saturday. So that's when our film essentially will officially have premiered. But we are looking at doing more. We just submitted our film to the Berkshire International Film Festival. Somebody came onto our website. They offered a comment and they invited us to submit our film to the Berkshire International Film Festival. So we've done that. Again, I encourage you to go to our webpage, go to our website. Again, thelonghope.org. You can see some of the trailers there. You can, if you register, you will not only become a part of our mailing list, but we will also reach out to you and inform you when we are doing other screenings. And of course, we also have a calendar on there. So if you just check in from time to time, you can see on the calendar, the event calendar, when we are doing screenings in different places. So again, I encourage you to do that. Look, part of the reason we did this film is we're trying to get people motivated and understanding what fight is, and hopefully that you'll join in our fight, because we can't do this on ourselves. We can't fight this all by ourselves. And what we're fighting are the three legal doctrines, what I call the illegal doctrines of the United States, that have been used to oppress Native people, and used it in such a way that there's no other way to describe it. Explain how are they described? Here's how the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, how they described these doctrines, policies, and practices based on or advocating superiority of peoples or individuals on the basis of national origin, racial, religious, ethnic, or cultural differences. What they say is they are racist, scientifically false, legally invalid, morally condemnable, and socially unjust. So if the doctrine of Christian discovery and the trust doctrine and the plenary powers doctrine are racist, scientifically false, because they are based on the superiority of peoples, and if they are legally invalid, why are they still being cited every day in court proceedings? Why is this being stuff that when they pass a law, they claim that it's based on settled law? This isn't settled law. It's illegal. It's legally invalid, racist, scientifically false, morally condemnable, and socially unjust. That's what the rest of the world calls this. I mean, and look, they don't cite the specific legal doctrines, but this is what they're talking about. So we need your help. I'm going to tell you right now, 3 Supreme Court justices have questioned the plenary powers doctrine. Clarence Thomas did it over 20 years ago. But since then, Sam Alito has questioned it, and now Neil Gorsuch has questioned it. Now, my biggest question is, where are the liberal justices? Where's last week, and I think I probably mentioned the week before. But if there are 3 justices already questioning the plenary powers doctrine for whatever reason, and first and foremost, what they're questioning is it constitutional? Is it really legal for the United States to claim ultimate and exclusive power over Native people's lives? Is it legal? Is it constitutional? But where are Jackson, Kagan, and Sotomayor? Because even if we can argue that Gorsuch, Alito, and Thomas have perhaps their own agenda in mind, maybe they have other motivations other than trying to secure our free and independent existence. I don't necessarily think that that's what they're going for. In fact, when I first read Clarence Thomas's questioning of the plenary powers, I got the sense from reading it that he thinks that they had to come up with another solution other than asserting that there was some sort of constitutionality behind the plenary powers doctrine. I think he thinks that the United States somehow has to address our claim to sovereignty and the United States recognition of quote unquote tribal sovereignty. I think it's problematic. In fact, Clarence Thomas says the court has been schizophrenic. But currently, Thomas and Gorsuch are challenging a case called the Canandaigua case, which is essentially what was the first real case beyond the stuff that came out of the 18th century or the 19th century, the 1830s under Chief Justice John Marshall. It is a case where they firmly establish the plenary powers doctrine. Of course, they wrote it into law in 1871 during the Appropriations Act, but Canandaigua is a case where it relies, the first case that relies solely on the plenary powers doctrine. And now you got two justices, and I got to think Alito's in there too. So this stuff is fraying. These things are crumbling. They are falling apart. The house of cards is beginning to collapse a little bit. And I'm not saying let's just stomp all over it. I'm saying, look, let's lift off some of those cards. Let's take away some of the authorities that you claim to have had under the plenary powers doctrine, the trust doctrine, and the doctrine of Christian discovery. Let's wipe out some of those claims that Ruth Bader Ginsburg and other recent courts keep asserting over and over and over again. Let's strike it. Let's get rid of those three things. We still look. There's some other issues we have to resolve. We still have reparations over residential schools. We still have land claims. We still have any number of things that we need to address. But as long as you have those three legal doctrines, you seem to think you can do whatever you want to do. You can cheat us on gaming. How ironic is that? Gaming, and yet you have an unfair advantage. And New York State took billions of dollars of hard-earned money from the Seneca Nation, a people who a third of their population still lives below the poverty line, but New York State took several $billion away and turned around and gave $500 million to the local billionaire to build a new stadium for the football team. We won't even get into the alleged curse of the Buffalo Bills. By the way, what is a Buffalo Bill? The only Buffalo Bill I know of is the guy who boasted about being an Indian killer, and then used Native people for years in his Wild West show. Yeah, Buffalo Bill Cody. So yeah, we got all kinds of problems. We can get into mascots and a discussion another time. I've never really targeted the Buffalo football team, but it's questionable, especially when they play the Kansas City football team. It gets really kind of awkward. But anyway, all right. So the reason we're doing this film is we're trying to generate more awareness about the legally invalid nature of the doctrines that still guide policy, practices, and law when it comes to Native people. And that they are indeed, as the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People said, first and foremost, that it's racist, that it's scientifically false, legally invalid, morally condemnable, and obviously socially unjust. We need to fix this. And frankly, we as Native people, we need your help, because we're not going to enter into courts necessarily, but we need you to influence those judges who sit in the court. So when a case does come before them, like Gorsuch and Thomas are battling right now, let them win on this thing. Let the liberal justices join these three conservative justices, so they got 6 judges saying, yeah, that's all crap. This plenary powers thing is crap, because it's going to unravel quite a bit once you do that. But regardless of how inconvenient and uncomfortable it might be, it's got to happen, because it's wrong. It's legally invalid, scientifically false. It's racist. And I know people don't like it when we pull the race card, but we're not saying this. The rest of the world is saying it. The entire world stood behind this UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. Only 4 nations voted against it: the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. Everybody else either voted for it, or maybe they abstained. But only 4 nations opposed it, and they're still opposing it to this day. You entered into agreements, whether they were properly ratified or not, where you acknowledge that our land is ours. We're just asking you to honor your word. That's all we've ever asked. And if you're not going to honor it, then maybe we need to take some of that land back. Maybe we do. I want to thank you for listening. I'm John Kane. This is Resistance Radio. Thanks for listening. Yahweh.